This is basically a smear campaign, I guess, against people who consider themselves left or left-leaning, and against who are against the war and or other like establishment things. So, if the title is "The Con Artists Who Blame Ukraine Aid for America's Social Problems," RFK Jr., Glenn Greenwald, and other Putin apologists are making disingenuous pseudo-populist arguments against U.S. support for the Ukraine war. I added the war part. This is written by Arlarrick D. Arment.
Yeah, this is in the New Republic. This is another magazine that went down the toilet. They used to be pretty good too.
Yeah, now they're gone.
Yeah, they're pretty bad now. So I'll just skip to the article, to the paragraphs where they're smearing. Among them is Glenn Greenwald, whose Substack has more than 300,000 subscribers, whose online talk show System Update draws hundreds of thousands of views. In December, on Tucker Carlson, since canceled Fox News show, Greenwald said, quote, "I've been asking since February, in what conceivable way will the lives of American citizens be materially improved? How will you and your family's lives be protected or fostered by sending tens of billions of dollars, now in excess of $100 billion, for the war in Ukraine?" End quote. And then they go to Jimmy Dore. Jimmy, whose YouTube show has more than 1.2 million followers, was a featured speaker at February's Rage Against the War Machine rally in Washington. There, he criticized the, quote, over 100 billion, end quote, sent to Kyiv, telling the crowd, quote, "We could have spent the money saving lives with universal health care, but instead we send the money taking lives overseas, which is our specialty."
You know
how is he wrong?
No, go ahead. How
is he freaking wrong?
That was a trigger paragraph. Go ahead. Whoever.
And kid, I pass to you, because I think we get on the same note here, because you notice how they just say they're calling like, "Look at how wrong this quote is." Then they don't explain why it's wrong. Like,
yeah,
you feel like he's spitting facts to me, right?
Exactly. Because hold on, this is something that I even covered early on in 2020. I forget which article it was or outlet it was where they criticized Jimmy Dore, and I remember Daniel and I are both looking at it. We're talking about live on air and said, "Okay, you're quoting Jimmy. Okay, if you're critical of Jimmy Dore, especially in the New Republic article right here, what did he say that was so wrong and offensive?" You quote a guy, and if I'm just a person, an average Joe reading, I'll be like, "Hey, this Jimmy Dore guy is saying something pretty correct here." You're not giving your counter argument, because this person who wrote this article, Alaric Depart, I don't care how you pronounce his name, can't even give a consistent response about what's wrong with Jimmy Dore in that statement there. These people who write these articles are inconsistent, and not to mention, dare I say, this what you know what I call articles like this? The rent was due. The rent was due, so they're pulling stuff out of their
bingo. That's
butt.
exactly it. Because the reason why they can't really give full quotes, the reason why they have to play so fast and loose with the arguments that Jimmy and Glenn and I guess RFK are making, is because they are completely just fighting a straw man. No one is saying that for the $150 billion we sent to Ukraine, we could solve every problem here at home. Nobody's making that argument. What the argument is that it's an insult to people in our country that we are sending $150 billion to Ukraine when for $9 billion a year we can fund tuition-free 2-year colleges for everybody who wants to go. That is an insult. We're not saying we could solve every problem in our country with the money we're sending to Ukraine. Nobody's saying that. It's a straw man. That's why they can't really give full quotes.
You want to know what issue can be solved, though? Homelessness.
Yes, homelessness could have been solved, what, 6 times over for what we're sending to Ukraine? Yeah.
100
and that's
billion.
Why they can't even mention that. They got to bring up, they're like, let's find the biggest spending leftist principle. That's why they bring up universal. You see universal healthcare right there? They can't bring up just basic shit like homelessness that you guys could have solved with Ukraine war funding. They got to pick the biggest number possible and then make it seem absurd. One last thing I'll say before I'll pass to you, CJ. And the same tactic this article is using. Do you remember a segment that we covered maybe a few months ago, CJ, with Jen Psaki was quote unquote debunking Ukrainian quote unquote Putin talking points, and she didn't even say anything to debunk it. And this is what the professional managerial class do. They just quote what you say smugly and then laugh. And Jen Psaki did a whole statement where she thought she was debunking people. She's like, they say that these Putin apologists say that Russia feels threatened because of NATO encroachment. Then she went on like, you didn't debunk the statement, right? You just doing a smug, evil laugh after saying something doesn't mean you're debunking. But that's what the professional managerial class does, and that's what this article is. This article like, look at these people, look at their views, they different than us. Like, you're not making an argument, but go ahead.
All right, so I'll read this I'll read this paragraph. This one's about RFK Jr. And then there's RFK Jr., the anti-vaxxer, running a long shot challenge to President Biden for the Democratic Party nomination. In his campaign announcement speech, Kennedy contrasts the quote $113 billion committed to the Ukraine war, end quote, with the quote 57% of Americans who can't put their hands on $1,000 if they have an emergency, end quote. Go ahead.
CJ, I'm asking you another question. Am I mistaken? Is this article about public health, or are you guys talking about foreign policy? So this article is about Ukraine. So why are you leading with anti-vaxxer shit? You guys, why is that the one issue that always get brought up? You know what I mean? Like they don't say RFK the anti-war activist. You know what I mean? They don't say RFK the guy who believes in fighting climate change. It's that RFK the anti-vaxxer. And if you're talking about public health, that makes sense. But why bring up the anti-vaxxer shit?
Well, it's because they have a guilty conscience. The point of an article like this, number one, as Kit said, it's the rent is due, right? They needed something to print in the damn thing, right? So let's let's pick an argument that we could straw man. We'll get 1,000 words out of it, right? But the other thing is it signals a certain guilty conscience because this article is just about signaling to their readers, no, you're correct to support Ukraine. We know you're probably having doubts about it, but you shouldn't. You're correct to do it. And so, they will just throw out anything against anybody. I'm really surprised they didn't take more shots at Jimmy, right? I mean, they let him off for relatively easy in that one, right? They could have called him the anti-vax or the, whatever, boogaloo, whatever. I mean, they could have thrown a lot more at him.
Wait, is anyone reading this paragraph right here? Because again, look at how this paragraph's being written out. I don't mean to cut you off.
You can go ahead. You can go ahead, Kid. No, go ahead, Kid, if you want to read it because you got better eyes than mine. Go ahead.
Yeah. Okay, all three figures. So he mentions RFK, Jimmy. I don't know who the third person is.
Glenn.
Are peddling a false economy. Yeah, Glenn Greenwald. Sorry about that. Sorry, Glenn. Are peddling a false economy and preventing the traditional guns versus butter debate. But their message resonates with millions because it plays into genuine anger and frustration over economic inequality, as well as a concern in the states for foreign entanglements, particularly in the wake of the Iraq War and misadventures in Libya, Syria, Afghanistan, especially salient. So it's especially salient in the context of polls indicating that Americans' bipartisan support for the war in Ukraine, while still strong, no, it's not, has softened considerably amid the presidential campaign, whose outcome could play a pivotal role in Ukraine's ability to secure aid from the U.S., its strongest backer so far. So in other words, wait a minute. In this paragraph, the author does acknowledge that there is growing anger. People are starving, and $100+ billion is going to this ridiculous war. Hey, author of the of this hit piece on Glenn, Jimmy, and RFK Jr., are you secretly signaling to us that, hey, look, I think this job is BS. Please let the resistance happen. Let the revolution happen. Because otherwise, I'm not understanding what their argument is. The rent was due.
Their argument is you should still support the current thing. Right?
Yeah.
We told you support the current thing, so you did. It looks like the current thing is starting to suck, but we still want you to support it, and we trust that a lot of you still do, but you're maybe second-guessing yourself for supporting the current thing. So we wanted to print this article to put to rest any anxiety you may have about continuing to support the current thing. That's what it is. That's what the headline should have been. Still support the current thing. That would have been a good title for the article.
That's what this is about. Yeah. Anyone want to... Go ahead.
I mean, it reads like a Newsweek propaganda article, just with a little more complicated than the lobotomy cases that read Newsweek. They're getting into the Maidan coup. Newsweek would decide, no, that's going to be too much for our readers. They're not going to be able to follow that. So it's like a little smart. It's like the Atlantic, basically. It's people who fancy themselves too smart for Newsweek but want the same narratives. That's basically what this is. It's that calling them an anti-vaxxer, that kind of thing, where you're just not doing journalism and the people who read it don't expect you to. Like I said, this used to be better. What happened?
Oh, the New Republic used to be pretty good.
Yeah.
They used to have some really good
what
stuff.
Happened?
Yeah.
I'm actually a little surprised.
I hear Nick somewhere.
The reason why I call leaders accurately fascist, I call our state authoritarian, because I told you guys, it's actually, when you look at the tactics that our ruling class use against their enemies, they're actually often effective. Like, you see how they talk about Putin. That's how we should talk about all politicians, correct? The way they talk about Nicholas Dore, the way we should talk about all politicians, correct? So I propose this. You guys see how they say RFK, the anti-vaxxer, and that's every no matter what the topic is, they'll bring up RFK, the anti-vaxxer, Jimmy Dore, the anti-vaxxer. They always bring those things up. So why is that the issue that supersedes all others? So it becomes your title. Like, you get this issue wrong, that's now your title. You're the if I got vaccine wrong, I am the anti-vaxxer Nick Cruz. The anti-vaxxer Nick Cruz have this opinion on this. So I propose, and this is how I generally talk, right? How about the Iraq war supporter, the war criminal Joe Biden, the Nazi funder Bernie Sanders? How about every single time we mention AOC, every single time we mention the squad, we say they might be having a climate protest. We say, oh, there's a climate protest led by Nazi funder AOC.
Well, the answer is embedded in the answer is embedded in the question, right? Because the Iraq war, Nazis in Ukraine, these are all issues that affect other people really far away. Whereas these people perceive the vaccine issue to affect whoever's standing within 6 feet of them, basically, right? And so it's more personal to them.
Joe Biden, police supporter Joe
Biden. I like this idea, Nick. I like this idea. Pro-censorship Instagram model AOC.
Future OnlyFans content creator. There you go.
Pro-censorship Sam Cedar chimes in.
Yeah.
Let me read this part.
They do that. Their bad takes are their titles from now on. But go ahead, CJ.
This is the last part because this is unbelievable. Jimmy Dore regularly parrots Russian how do you say that? Canards. Yeah, I don't know what that is. Canards like the claim that Ukraine's 2014 revolution of dignity was a U.S.-backed coup, and they put it with quotes.
Man, this guy
a flat out lie that the Kremlin lobbed as a false accusation after the revolution, and that has since become a key pro-Russian propaganda talking point to discredit Ukraine's government. Greenwald, they also mentioned him in this, in a video last month said, quote, "We're not in Ukraine to help the Ukrainian people. The real reason in Ukraine is to sacrifice Ukraine, to destroy Ukraine in order to bleed Russia," end quote. And RFK in a May interview with Unheard, I think that's how you say it, called the conflict, quote, a U.S. war against Russia to essentially sacrifice the flower of Ukrainian youth in an abattoir of death.
Avatar.
I don't know what that is. Avatar of death and destruction for the geopolitical ambition of the neocons, off-stated of regime change for Vladimir Putin and exhausting the Russian military so they can't fight anywhere else in the world. That's what he says. Go ahead.
You will literally hear
State
of Department officials all the time. And there's an interview I'm going to react to maybe on Nick and Knight. I'm trying to remember. There was just a guy on Morning Joe who was some Democrat House member. He was asked by the guy who was filling in for Joe Scarborough, why should Americans be invested in the war in Ukraine? Actually, in another person was Mike Pence. He also gave an answer at a recent town hall where he said the same exact thing. Mike Pence was asked, why should Americans care about the Ukraine war? And he said, well, Americans should care about the Ukraine war because if we fight this war against Russia, it will weaken them militarily. So what this writer is saying is a conspiracy theory. We have multiple public officials openly acknowledged. So this guy has spread multiple falsehoods in that paragraph. And there's a story a few weeks ago on how media members was talking about how they was intimidated about reporting on the neo-Nazi presence in Ukraine, even though there's overwhelming evidence. And there was quotes from people in media that said they didn't want to report on what was obvious. They didn't want to report on Nazis in Ukraine because if they did, they would be vilified as repeating Putin talking points. You guys remember that story we did a few weeks ago? They said we don't want to cover it, and many mainstream media, corporate media people don't want to talk about it, because if you talk about anything that's true against the Ukrainians, you're labeled Putin talking point. And that's regarding this here as well. This guy literally denies the fact that was written in Western media outlets. There was a BBC documentary talking about the Maidan coup, and there's an article in Jacob talking about how CIA train neo-Nazi elements in Ukraine and train them to wage war and guerrilla tactics and getting prepped them to wage the coup. Like, these things have been mainstream accepted ideas until the mainstream media.
Right.
I'm sorry, until the Ukraine war happened, and then the mainstream media and the NATO left immediately flipped their positions, and then they call anyone like Jimmy Dore, RBN, Dissidence HardLens Media, Max Blumenthal, and many others like Glenn Greenwald that they smear. That anyone who, and Noam Chomsky as well, who say the same thing that the corporate media used to say. Now all of a sudden we repeat Putin talking points, and that's how propaganda works. They label facts as a Russian narrative. You repeat the Russian narrative, you're a Russian plant. It's unbelievably manipulative what they do. But go ahead, guys, if you guys want to chime in.
Well, he calls it the revolution of dignity. I mean, I haven't heard it referred to too many times as that. Everybody always calls it the Maidan coup, the Maidan revolution, right? The fact that he would use that propaganda term, I've heard it a couple times, but very, very rarely. That would be like referring to the Iraq war today as Operation Iraqi Freedom, right? Like if you're just writing an article about the Iraq war, call it the thing that that Bush wanted you to call it, right? Exactly. That's giving away the game a little bit, tipping his hand.
That's the we was welcome as liberators.
Right. Yeah. Right. Exactly. Right.
Well, you know, the only chink in their armor is they don't yet have Orwell's envisioned system of pneumatic tubes where you can burn yesterday's news, because you could very easily just Google all of these articles that were being written until 5 minutes before the war broke out about the Nazis in Ukraine. All these people now say, it's very easy. Very easy to find it.